Hi, I'm Taylor Davis. This is Paul Warburton, and we welcome you to the Sales and Retention Predictions video for Security, Payer, and Clinical Communications. Now, it's kind of a mix of market segments, right, Paul? And we had sort of two groups. So we had the security markets that we watch over here. We had the payer markets, and we put them together into the single webinar because it just didn't quite make sense to break them out into their own webinars. So anyway.
Yeah, and there's some alignment there, and we're going to talk through some of those things. And of course, the sales and retention model is the same model for all of our segments. So
exactly. But before we talk about these markets, let's jump in and just give a quick recap on the model and how do we think about this model before we jump in and actually apply it and use it in some of these market segments.
Excellent.
So I'm gonna jump in here and talk through this. Now, statistical models is something that I'm pretty familiar with, and I find as I talk to people, they don't always think the same way that I do. So I'm used to building models and seeing other people's models and seeing that sometimes these models are, they'll make weird predictions, right? And then you look at the data and you go, oh, well, that makes sense that it made a weird prediction.
Right.
That data point was outside of really the model's assumptions, or, that data point had really some unique things to it. So what did we do? We put together a model where we looked at, over several years, the data, the feedback from customers, and then we looked at the next year at what were the sales and retention that we saw in the market. So sales share is one of the variables that we're trying to predict, and also retention. If you want to know more about these models, which you might if you haven't watched the first video, here's the link to the first video, and we encourage you to go take a look at it. But as we walk through this model, know these are not classes' predictions of what's going to happen. These are the model's predictions, and we're going to talk about where we think the model is a little bit weird, a little bit off, and where we think it's really on. Even where the model, though, is a little bit funny, there's a lot of things that we can learn from it. Why is the model predicting one way or another? And it can identify some opportunities or risks that vendors have, even where the prediction may not be right on.
Yeah, the great thing about the model is it's one more tool in the analyst toolkit that really helps us better understand the market and look more deeply at these vendors we're going to dig into.
And you're exactly right. We wish that we could dig in on all of these data points as much as we would like to, but there's just not enough time. So we're gonna cover 6 market segments today. We're gonna be flying through them. And as you have more questions, just a reminder, this is only vendors who are joining our webinar today. We're being really careful about that. And we ask you to not share this or the upcoming report with any providers. We're doing this to help give insights to our vendor partners so that they can connect the feedback of customers to the future sales and retention. And as you have additional questions, reach out to Paul or some of our other analysts, and we are eager to talk through those questions with you.
Absolutely.
So let's just a quick overview of the model and how does it work. Let me just give an analogy similar to what the model is. When we are looking for a product or a service and we're looking to contract with it, in life, I don't think that we always realize that the why is usually more important than the if somebody recommends it. So for instance, if I were to come to you, Paul, and to say, hey, that movie, and we'll just make up a movie, right? That movie, hey, did you like that movie?
Yes, I loved that movie.
Okay, so the conversation is never gonna just stop right there, right? Because, there could be reasons why Paul liked that movie, and I don't really like movies for those type of reasons. So I'm always going to ask a why question. If you think about it, I think everybody always does. So I'll say, so what did you like about that movie? Which is really a why question. Why did you like it, right?
And of course, I loved it because the script was really creative and there were some really funny actors and actresses in it.
And then at this point, I started thinking about what do I like as far as movies, and I love creative scripts, and I love really strong characters that are really well developed. And so I think I'd probably like that. Now, if you had said, oh, it was a really sensitive, slow moving, but provocative movie, I think I'd say, well, that's interesting. That doesn't sound like the type of movies that I watch. On the other side, you would maybe say, wow, that was the special effects were amazing. That made the movie. I think, I don't usually think that special effects make the movie. So really, depending on why you like the movie, is why maybe I would be interested. And similarly, when it comes to healthcare technology, we are able to see with this model the whys that potential customers are looking for. So if I am a customer of one of these technologies in healthcare, and I'm going to somebody else and saying, hey, I'm looking for a vendor, and then I ask, why do you like this vendor? I tend to be listening on average for market leadership, innovation, executive partnership, and integration. And that fits. Each of us have done thousands of interviews at the time that we've been here at class. And that fits. We've talked to hundreds, each of us, hundreds of organizations making decisions. And these are things that we hear anecdotally, but now we have a model that starts to quantify these. And it may not be the same in every market segment, but in general, that's what we're seeing, and that's what this market is predicting.
Absolutely. I love the fact that class sits on 20 years of these interviews where we've actually been able to isolate these factors through many buying decisions.
So as we talk about this, let's talk about how do we isolate some of these. We're using a variable called rank. And instead of looking at the actual ratings, so you can see here that we have the ratings for a product on the right-hand side. Instead of looking at the actual ratings, a 7.3 or an 8.1, what we want to know is we want to line them up from high to low and say, okay, which question is rated the highest and which question is rated the lowest. So your highest rated question is a 15, lowest is a 1. We skip overall satisfaction so that we can make this congruent with the class fingerprint. And you can see here that the areas where, if I say, why did you like this product? Some of the things that you're likely to say why you like it are likely some of the questions that are the highest rated questions on the class survey, right? And so likely to recommend, hey, I feel like this is a real market leader product, or the support question is very high there. Hey, they have really, really good support.
And integration tends to be one of those nerves that we've seen over the last 20 years as being probably one of the biggest indicators of satisfaction in healthcare today.
Absolutely. So here are 5 of those questions that tend to really matter, and there's lines of demarcation. When these questions are relatively higher, we tend to see higher sales and retention, and you can see some of the data there in terms of where these are. Let me just highlight a couple things though. Likely to recommend is an interesting one that I'll talk about here in a second. We see ranks of that everywhere. Delivery of new technology is an interesting question where we tend to, that tends to be a lower rated question compared to other questions. So we tend to see lower ranks. So when delivery of new technology gets above a 6, then we start saying, hey, that's pretty high. And so there's different questions that hang out in different sort of rank neighborhoods. and you can see here that there's some that we really like to see quite high. One other one that's a little bit unique is forecasted overall satisfaction. Where we really see the challenge here is when it gets really low. So when that starts getting down to a rank of 5 or less, that's when we really see sales and retention start to fall off. So there's not as much of a bump effect when it's high, but when it gets really low, that starts saying that customers are losing their optimism. So interesting, there's a story on each of these that we can't go into today. But if we dig into likely to recommend, here's how often we see that falling in different ranks. And you can see that it falls all across the spectrum. And then you can see how there's such a strong trend between what rank we see in one year and then the sales share we see in the next year, what rank we see in one year, and the retention that we see in the next year. So this is a very, very strong trend. And the strongest part of the model overall is looking at this one question. So as some markets, like security, as we talk about, they may be a little bit unique in terms of what drives some of the decisions. A security decision will be quite a bit different than an EMR decision. However, the one question to keep your eye on is likely to recommend. And when you see that at a 13 or a 14 or a 15, that's an indication that customers are saying, hey, this is the market leader. We really feel like we partnered with the market leader.
And that makes sense, especially when you talk about something like security, because in security, people are looking for stability.
Yes, exactly.
And know that you are actually on that premier product is extremely important.
Exactly. So let's jump right in and let's talk about first secure clinical communications. This is a really dynamic market. I know that you've watched this. You've been the author of several reports in this market. So when we looked at the model, both of us looked at the model and we were like, that was not what I expected to see. So we've seen almost 50 decisions in the past 2 years. You see a TigerText, who we've seen win a lot of decisions. The model predicts low. Mm-hmm. You see a Cerner, who we haven't seen win a lot of decisions. The model predicts high. And so there's some interesting dynamics here. Walk us through, you can see the x-axis where we've observed over the last couple of years, and the y-axis what the model is predicting. Walk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, there's actually really some fascinating things that we're seeing here, and even things that maybe aren't necessarily a surprise. So for instance, to see Epic out here on the far right, But also, we don't necessarily, the model isn't predicting quite as high, because when you actually think about Epic's solution in this space, it's not an additional product you buy. It's already baked in. You're simply turning it on. And a lot of the innovation around communications, it really deals with their customers going out and buying third-party solutions that will then connect into that. So when you actually look at delivery of new technology for Epic, the rank is a little bit lower as compared to someone like Cerner, whereas Cerner's actually building out each piece of that communications infrastructure.
So a different strategy that the models can't take into account, right?
Right.
Yes. But as you talk about delivering new technology, this is interesting. So Cerner has the highest rank here. So Cerner customers are saying, hey, we're seeing a lot of movement. And then after that, you look at PerfectServe, and then after that, customers are not saying that they're seeing a lot of new things coming out from their vendors. It's not one of the whys as to why they're recommending their products today, right?
And that's one of the fascinating things about this space in general, is because the high variation of what different customers are looking for. And actually, as it turns out, Cerner has actually sold pretty consistently to those who are really focused on nurse workflows. Whereas someone like a Halo and PerfectServe, they have a myriad of different types of customers, and they're attempting to be all things to all customers, and hence why, hey, some of your customers who may be more on the ambulatory side of Halo saying, you know what, I'm not seeing as much development on these tools as I saw in the past, as Halo spends, well, now owned by Simpler, they spend more time focusing on building out the inpatient infrastructure, right? So they're going to be rating Halo lower there, whereas some of the those on the inpatient side for Halo, they're saying, oh, now I'm seeing things, so I'm going to rate it higher, but it's not consistent across our customer base. So you're seeing variability.
So let me ask you, the model has 3 vendors whose rank is at a 14 or a 15 for likely to recommend. So that's Vocera, that's Epic, and that's Simpler. Does that match what we're hearing in feedback in the market of customers saying, hey, I think we have the premier solution that we're working with here?
And that actually is one of the fascinating things that I think it hits right on with, because you actually have several vendors that they say, hey, this solution, they've got great technology, and we think this is going to be the winning horse. Not that it has everything we expect it to today, or it covers every single clinical communication workflow, but how they look at the size of their vendor, they look at the development roadmap, they look at how much they've integrated, like the Voceras out there, and they actually end up saying, you know what, we want to bet on this horse.
That's interesting.
And so we actually have several vendors in this space, and that's why when you actually look at potential replacement, it's less about a replacement space right now, and it's really more about who are the vendors that customers are saying, let's build out all this clinical communication infrastructure together with.
Yes, okay. Well, let's jump over. So as we look at a TigerText, likely to recommend is a 10. They definitely get pulled down quite a bit by support's integration goals. So that's one that really pulls them down. Is that what we're also seeing in the market? Do they have an opportunity to build tighter integration there? Is that a challenge for them?
That's definitely something they're working to build out. And again, Tiger Connect is one of those solutions that they have a very large ambulatory base, and their integration needs are very different from those customers that are in the inpatient space, right?
Yes.
Especially when you're talking about communication device integration, right?
Yes.
And it's these people on the inpatient side saying, hey, we like your vision, so we're likely to recommend, but the actual integration today, some of it still needs to be built out. Whereas on the ambulatory side, they're actually saying, well, the integration we need for our use cases lines up really well. And case in point, you look at someone like Dr. First, who the model actually predicts really high, but actually they're a vendor that really plays just in the ambulatory space. So what is their integration need that they're actually looking to address? It's bringing in the patient communication, which COVID, made that such a key workflow
Absolutely.
For a lot of these guys. And so their history in patient communications pre-COVID, just about all these guys have built something since COVID, but Dr. First lead there has given them an edge and helped boost that. And thus the model looks at that integration ranking and reports out higher predicted sales for them.
And I would say, just from my seat, as I've talked to folks, I'd say Tiger has had a very, very strong go-to-market strategy over the last several years. They've had a strong strategy to bring in customers with a no or low cost option and then to be able to move them up. So it's interesting because this model really looks at the energy behind the customers. It doesn't take into account how well do you capitalize on that energy. And from what I've seen, Tiger's done a good job of capitalizing on a lot of that energy. But this model, if I'm Tiger, I may be watching this saying, hey, we could actually even be doing better if we were able to firm up in some of these areas such as supports, integration goals, and some of those other areas. So even a firm where we've seen high sales in the past and the model predicts low, that actually could even be good news because it says, hey, we could possibly even be better if we were able to supercharge the feedback coming from our customers, which today is not horrible, but it could be better.
Absolutely. I think across this space, we're going to see continued growth and opportunities.
Well, as we talk about this, let's talk about some of the retention predictions, which are different. These are tied. So here you see Cerner goes from the highest to the lowest in terms of predictions, right? And Cerner also has some challenges with customer satisfaction. Walk us through what are some of the drivers when it comes to low prediction for Cerner and high prediction for some other players out there.
Exactly. And really what that's coming down to is when you actually start to look at the breadth of those inpatient workflows. And like I pointed out earlier, Cerner has built a good niche here with a lot of the nurses and managing those workflows. But as we know that, hey, due to COVID, a lot of virtual care, patient communications, and all these other clinical communication workflows have significantly increased as a result of COVID. There is many of their current customers are actually saying, well, you do this today, and I know you've mastered and we can continue to help our nurses, but really, what are you guys doing to connect me to your other solutions within this? And is it actually a strategy where you go somewhere else? And so their actual performance has dropped off as customers are looking other places and saying, are there other solutions which are more enterprise capability, not necessarily just tied to the EMR?
Right? And you've talked a lot about it, but a couple areas where firms could differentiate themselves even more: integration and innovation, right? And there's opportunities in both of these too. So there's a bit of a race, as you said. Hey, we want to know which horse is going to win out in this race, and expectations are high in both of those areas from customers, right?
Absolutely. Interoperability even steps into this because for some of these ambulatory places, these communication solutions actually are kind of an interoperability tool because you are sending the data, but all of a sudden, hey, I've got a question about this or I need to know this. That physician-to-physician connection, it really amps up your interoperability capabilities. So they keep getting brought in and saying, we want to pull in more of this patient data into these tools and things like that.
I wish we could spend an hour just on these few slides and talking about this market. This is really interesting. So let's talk about healthcare IoT security. This is a really interesting market. You have two players, Assembly and Medigate, that personally, if I ran another company that was competing against them, I would be nervous. Very specialized to healthcare, class scores in the mid-90s for both of those. And as we run this model, they both show up with very high predicted sales. You can see that here, but as we jump to the whys behind, both of them have a 15 for likely to recommend. So help us understand, what are these two firms doing? Are they seeing the same energy that the model is predicting, and what can we expect going forward?
Yeah, that's a great point. So this model actually lines up very well with what KLAS is seeing in the rest of the market for IoT. Case in point, really what we're talking about here with IoT, we just have pretty much all hospitals today are seeing a boom in the number of devices they have to connect into these systems, right?
Absolutely.
To keep data moving. And so just having someone that can provide that transparency and reduce the security threats from each new connection is key. And so there's a couple real key things happening here. And one of them is that sense that you're on the premier product. This is a space where Assembly and Medigate really got first mover advantage into this space.
Okay.
Really, Medigate was huge here because they stepped in, healthcare specific, they get it. They're not coming from as a cross-industry vendor.
When you say they get it, you mean their customers are saying that?
Their customers saying they get the healthcare world, right?
Yes.
Whereas someone like a Palo Alto, they're coming into it from a cross-industry point of view. And the complexity, in addition, it was an acquisition of a solution that got them into this space. And so the sense that, hey, they really understand the complexity of what a hospital grade device is and the level of an HL7 interface and how that feeds in. There's much more nuance to those connections than in any other type of connection you see, like financial and manufacturing. It's much more simple.
And I want to be really clear, it's not that KLAS is saying, hey, one is better than the other, but we're reflecting the feedback of customers. Because you could expect being, I guess you could say, born in healthcare or coming from outside, both of those could bring strengths or weaknesses. But so far, feedback from customers has been stronger with an Assembly or a Medigate who have that understanding. So really reflecting the feedback of customers, and the model is quantifying a lot of that feedback, right?
And the other thing you want to point out why Assembly is doing so well, they actually have a smaller customer base than Medigate. And so their ability to have this hands-on touch, another thing, executive involvement, just a huge key factor for healthcare organizations. The ability to have that connection with their customers also drives up that rank in the model for Assembly.
Interesting. Let's jump forward to retention. So we're expected to see high retention for Medigate. And so as we look here, high and very high retention for Medigate and Assembly, high retention for Order, lower for Palo Alto. Not really a low KLAS score, but especially when you see supports integration goals being quite low. Vendors where we see that, we tend to sometimes see some drop off of customers, right?
Yeah. Supports integration goals is key in this segment because that's literally all they're doing in IoT. Well, they're connecting and then providing the transparency and visibility through the displays into it. And so when you see someone like Palo Alto scoring so low there, that's why it's like, well, are they actually meeting their commitments to their customers if they're not doing extremely well at this piece?
Oh, that's really insightful. So all vendors who may be watching this, if you're an Assembly or a Medigate, you're hopefully learning from this, hey, here's some things that we need to continue to do, and an Order or a Palo Alto, here's some things that we need to change to be more competitive in this space. But a very competitive market, and fascinating to watch this going forward, so critical. And we're just so grateful to see so many good options for healthcare organizations in this market. Let's jump over to identity and access management. This is a tricky space. KLAS, there are some additional vendors, particularly SailPoint, that we wish that we had more data on. And so as we've done our best in KLAS ratings, we've had some data, we haven't had them fully rated. They should be. I will say that as we've worked, they have worked to hide some, and we're really putting a focus this year on trying to find more of their organizations. And so we're not able to build a predictive model for them. But the two vendors that we are able to see, Imprivata and Identity Automation, fairly different players, even in terms of what they offer. But we see Imprivata is a high sales prediction, Identity Automation is a lower sales prediction. Just walk us through these two and acknowledging that this is not the whole market here.
Yeah, and we acknowledge it's not the whole market. That being said, when you talk about Imprivata, you're actually talking about 90% of the market.
That's exactly right.
And so even though there are some potentially innovative things happening in other places, the fact of the matter is when it comes to identity and access management, Imprivata didn't have anyone to compete with for years. This is not just software, so if you think about the difficulty about replacing this solution, and then you throw into the fact that this is a security thing, and so stability is key. And so when you look at there and you say, hey, likely to recommend an 11, so when you see someone as large as Imprivata not getting a 15 there, you start to say, is this a little bit of a commoditized sense here? But they do so well and it's so stable, it lines up exactly what KLAS sees happening in the market with people continuing to say, hey, let's stick with this. And that even goes into the retention piece. And why change a good thing?
And to Imprivata's credit, it's pretty common that we see when a vendor has really gained a lot of market share that some of their sales predictions will go down over time. And to their credit, they have a high sales prediction. And then as we look at the retention predictions, they have also a high retention prediction. And that really is a reflection of high satisfaction, high supports integration goals, a good, not stellar, but a good likely to recommend rank, a good, not stellar forecasted overall satisfaction rank. So again, we don't see a lot of market share shifts in this market anytime soon because your big player continues to be very competitive.
Exactly. And not just in this space, but Imprivata is working on broadening out their portfolio into other security areas, which further strengthens that reason to say, hey, they've been steady here, let's just keep adding on pieces.
And that packaging and integration across multiple spaces, that native integration across multiple spaces. That's something that the model doesn't take into account. But we've seen that that's a very powerful driver of success with sales and retention, right? So
Absolutely.
So let's jump over to patient privacy monitoring. This is an interesting market, and I haven't asked you this yet, Paul, but I really wanted to ask you about Iatric. You've got a market where you have two players with high predictions, two players with low predictions. Iatric is really interesting, where they have a high prediction for the innovation. Their rank is very high on innovation and very low when it comes to likely to recommend. So help us understand what's going on in this market.
Yeah, and really that gets into the whole world of how well can a model deal with something that's a very unique solution, right?
Yes.
And Iatric is really just focused on MetaTech.
Oh,
And so
okay.
this chart spells it out right here. And mind you, they do very well with connecting MetaTech.
Okay.
And they actually work not just in this area of patient privacy monitoring, but also in several areas as a integration solution for MetaTech. And so you actually are looking at a little bit of a unicorn right here.
Yes.
With Iatric and the work that they do. They do it well, but really they're staying within the lanes of MetaTech.
Okay, so that makes some sense as to what you would see here. And now the predictions line up fairly well to what we've seen in the past. And walk us through some of the other players, other than Iatric having, very, very unique set of ranks there. And I think that we would love to dig in with their team more on what we're seeing there. Walk us through what we're seeing in some of the other players here.
Yeah, so as a whole for this space, the ability to automate this process is crucial. So this is one of the areas where artificial intelligence has stepped in for a specific use case and has knocked it out of the park. And it's really enabled vendors like Protenus and SecureLink to step in, to put it in place. And it's actually the technology just puts out proactive notifications as needed, right? And so that's why you're looking at this likelihood to recommend. Customers put a premium on the automation side of this and how seamlessly it flows. And so you really see customers saying, we really feel like we're on the premier solutions with these, because they are kind of not exactly set it and forget it, but you set it, you put it in, and it does its job, and it builds credibility and safety within your organization. And solutions where, like Imprivata, for instance, they have a sales technology model, and that's great, and we've noted in other places it's driving great outcomes, but in a segment where it's really this technology piece that shines, the rank drops.
The secret sauce is this AI, which for a statistician is extremely fulfilling. So I always cheer for AI. I'm just kidding. But with a SecureLink or a Protenus, you just, customers have a little bit of a wow experience. And you see that both in the class score and you see that in the likely to recommend rank right here, right?
Absolutely. And thus when we move over to retention, you're saying, hey, who are people going to stick with? That also pans out very well.
Yes.
Now, like I point out, because with Imprivata, though, they actually have very high retention, because as people get in and use it, there are very strong outcomes to be had there. So no one's in a rush to displace their security outcomes, right?
Yes.
And bring in and associate themselves with more unnecessary risk. So you definitely see a very high retention there with Imprivata as well.
No, this has been so insightful. Let's jump over and talk about two of our payer segments here. And first, we're going to jump over to payer quality analytics. We've got two players now in these payer spaces. We need a good amount of data from current customers to be able to fuel the model, right?
Right.
So in both of these cases, some of the players where we've just only been able to interview less than 10 in the past year, the model can't run on that as effectively as we need it to. But when we look at two players where we've gotten a good amount of data, so you have MedInsight and Cotiviti, there's a fairly big difference in terms of what the model is predicting with those two. So walk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, this actually lines up really well with what we're seeing in the market. And one with MedInsight, you'll just see that likelihood to recommend. So their ability to actually have very broad functionality covering many different quality metrics and the different needs, because of course, every payer, they're going to have a little bit of their own flavor of what kind of quality metrics they want providers reporting back, and then of course they track them themselves. The breadth that MedInsight is offering their customers is really hard to beat. And
Yes.
that can be seen right here with Cotiviti when you actually look at that likelihood to recommend. They've done a fairly decent job working with their customers and I mean, look at their score. It's not a bad score. They're 78, right? But when you're actually looking at the breadth and variability, that all of a sudden, the lack of that functionality, the idea that you're really on the premier product that can meet the full breadth of your needs significantly drops.
Okay. Well, this is really interesting. Let's look at the retention side. It looks like more of the same. You have MedInsight with a higher satisfaction score, higher predicted retention, and a fairly similar story here, right?
And keep in mind, as we can talk about payers, they have lots of technology at their organizations, and they have lots of individuals who know how to use that technology at their organizations. So they are often more likely than, per se, like a provider, where they'll actually say, hey, let's actually just take some technology and we'll actually build some of the things we need to know ourselves.
Yes.
And actually do a lot more in-house analytics.
Especially the largest payers.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, let's also jump over and talk about risk adjustment. Now, this is a really interesting market. And I will say, again, we need a good amount of data to be able to fuel this model and be able to run it. And so as we look at a report that we published at the end of last year, not quite enough data on all of these to be able to really fuel this. So you've got a lot more players here than are going to show up in the model. Mm-hmm. Again, we're not sharing this model with providers because we always want to share as complete of a view. And so this is more the complete view of what are we seeing in the market. So as you look at this list of vendors here, tell me who's coming up a lot in some of the decisions that we're hearing about? Who has some of the most energy in the market that you're hearing?
Yeah, I immediately jumped to Arcadia and Vatica, and it's just because of the, again, breadth of capabilities and their willingness to iterate and build things for customers and customize their solutions.
And you could say innovation.
Innovation.
Right? Yeah, there you go, right?
Innovation, tying it back to the model. And so
yes.
Those are two that really do very well, and especially Arcadia on the provider side, who has a long history of providing all this and having to iterate and build things out for them and innovate. Right?
Yes.
And so those are the two I would point to with high energy.
Well, it's interesting because as we look at the model, both Arcadia and Vatica, not enough data here to show up in the model. So talk through some of the players who are showing up here, and what surprises are we seeing, and what's not as much of a surprise?
Yeah. So like I pointed out, MedInsight, they're one that, well, actually, let me back up one, just say something about the market in general here. There is a ton of energy in this market, and the key thing really that innovation is happening around is it's saying, hey, we've done a ton of risk management and risk adjustment here for years, but it's almost all retroactive and based on that retroactive data. And really, all the iteration, that long list of vendors you're seeing is who's actually bringing us forward with forward-looking risk adjustment.
Yeah.
I want to know who's going to be walking in those doors next week. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And things like that. And actually, that's why the robustness of these models has needed to grow. And jumping into this, when we see someone like a Ciox who sits on a tremendous amount of data and can actually create a lot of their own models and start predicting things and looking more future-looking, that's all of a sudden why delivery of new technology jumps up to a 12, right?
Wow, yes. There's a big difference there between...
There's a very big difference between them and the other solutions in this space, which very broad, capable technology, but we want to move into that forward-looking realm.
And this is an interesting... this is different than some of the other models. So Ciox has not a low score, but a score of an 80 compared to some of the other competitors that are in the high 80s or low 90s. But they have the highest predicted sales, and it's really because of what customers are saying. So there's still some opportunities that they have to improve their experience compared to some of their competitors. But there's some of that secret sauce when it comes to that innovation that is likely to fuel some energy in the market.
It bumps up that innovation rank, and the model jumps right into that.
Interesting. And they also have that likely to recommend rank. So customers, and you and I both know these interviews, where you have a customer who scores average, but they have a really high likely to recommend. So customers will say, yeah, there's some things that they could do better. But at the end of the day, they've got some secret sauce that really matters a lot to us. And that's what we're seeing here in this quantification as we look at Ciox, right?
Yep, exactly.
So let's also look at some of the retention predictions. In this case, everyone is pretty closely grouped, so there's not huge differences here. But you have fairly high satisfaction overall and high retention. Is that what we're seeing in the market? Are we seeing low turnover, or can we expect to see some changes here?
So one of the challenges with risk adjustment about this marketplace is it's not taking into account all of your newer startups, which are saying, hey, we have a different niche of how we look at this piece of risk, and we look at this. So really, when it comes to broad, capable functionality players in the market, this actually lines up really well. And we don't see people actually replacing them. But payers will go out and buy one or two of these newer solutions just for niche views on risk.
Oh, that's
for
great.
their customers.
Well, this is an interesting space. I know that this is one of our favorite spaces that our team loves to watch. So we are fascinated to see where this goes going forward. So as we wrap up today, if you have any questions, I hope that you send those through the chat, and hopefully you already have. We have our team answering those, and we are excited to follow up with anybody who has questions from what we've talked about today. Predictive models can be a little bit complicated. They can be a little tricky to understand, but there's some neat things here that we're excited to share with you, in addition to the standard data that we share with you on a regular basis. So we hope that you find this interesting, innovative, and helpful, and we're excited to continue the dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Taylor.